Let's wind the clock all the way back to the beginning. The kind of beginning that feels less like a fairy tale and more like the opening credits of a very dysfunctional reality show. If you've ever thought your family had drama, let me assure you the ancient Greek gods had you beat by several millennia. This is the story of a cosmic father who couldn't handle the idea of being replaced, a mother desperate to save her children, and one clever baby who grew up to change everything. Picture the universe before Zeus was king, before thunderbolts and temples, and all the dramatic affairs. Back then, the ones in charge were the Titans. They were massive, primeval beings who basically ran the cosmos like an exclusive club. And at the head of this club sat Cronus, the youngest of the Titans but also the most ambitious. He had gotten his power in a pretty gruesome way, by overthrowing his own father, Uranus, with a sickle. That set the tone for what kind of dad Cronus would later be: paranoid, ruthless, and not exactly winning any Father of the Year awards. See, Cronus had been warned by prophecy, because in Greek mythology there's always a prophecy that one of his own children would eventually overthrow him. Now, a rational parent might have taken that as a sign to work on their parenting skills. Maybe show some love, raise their kids well, and avoid being the kind of tyrant they'd want to replace. Cronus, he took the opposite approach. Every time his wife, Rhea, gave birth, he swallowed the baby whole. No lullabies, no cradle, just gulp. He figured if the kids never made it out of his stomach, they couldn't stage a coup. Imagine the family dinner table at that point. Rhea gives birth, Cronus pretends to coo at the baby for a second, then down the hatch. It's horrifying, but also weirdly cartoonish when you picture this towering father stuffing newborn gods into his belly like appetizers at a buffet. Inside him, the swallowed kids, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, were trapped but still alive, waiting in darkness. It was like the worst kind of family reunion, everyone crammed together in the stomach of their dad, grumbling about how unfair life was. Rhea, understandably, was done with this nonsense. She was tired of seeing every child she bore vanish into Cronus's gut. By the time she was pregnant again, with her sixth child, she decided something had to change. But what could she do? Her husband was paranoid, powerful, and not exactly open to compromise. That's when she came up with one of the most brilliant parenting hacks in mythology, the swaddled rock trick. When Zeus was born, Rhea hid him away on the island of Crete. Depending on which version of the story you read, he was raised in a secret cave, nursed by a divine goat named Amalthea, and protected by a band of noisy warriors called the Curetes. These warriors would clash their shields and dance whenever baby Zeus cried, so Cronus wouldn't hear the wails. Meanwhile, Rhea presented her husband with a rock wrapped in a blanket, as if it were the newborn. Cronus, not the most observant eater, swallowed it whole without noticing the difference. And just like that, the youngest child escaped his father's paranoia and lived to grow up. Let's pause here for a second, because this moment, this rock in a blanket deception, sets the stage for everything that comes after. If Cronus had caught on, there would have been no Zeus, no Olympian gods, no thunderbolts, no myths as we know them. It all hinged on a mother's clever trick and a father's lack of attention to detail. Imagine being outsmarted by a rock. That's a humiliation that echoes through history. So Zeus grew up in secret, far from his father's reach. The myths describe him as strong, cunning, and destined for greatness. Raised among nymphs, cared for by Amalthea the goat, and hidden in caves that echoed with the chants of the Curetes. He was a child of secrecy and survival. And unlike his siblings, he had the freedom to grow, to learn, and eventually to plot revenge. When Zeus reached adulthood, he was ready to confront his father. But he couldn't just march up to Cronus with a sword. After all, Cronus had 5 godly children locked inside his belly. The first step was freeing them. According to the stories, Zeus gave Cronus a special potion. Some say it was a drink prepared by the goddess Metis that caused him to vomit. And out came Zeus's siblings, one after another, miraculously unharmed despite their bizarre imprisonment. It's as if Cronus had been carrying around a divine storage locker for years, and now all the lost children were finally free. Think about what that meant. Zeus wasn't just the youngest kid. He was suddenly the leader of a full team of gods who all had a score to settle. Imagine growing up trapped inside your dad's stomach, only to be spit back out into the world and handed a second chance. That's motivation if I've ever heard it. And with Zeus leading the charge, the stage was set for a showdown that would shake the cosmos. This family feud wasn't just about who got to sit at the head of the divine dinner table. It was about the future of the universe. Cronus and the Titans represented the old order, ancient, brutal, and unwilling to let go of power. Zeus and his siblings, the Olympians, represented something new, a different way of ruling, with thunder and lightning as their symbols of authority. The clash between these two sides was inevitable, and it all started because one paranoid father couldn't stop eating his kids. But before we get into the war itself, it's worth sitting with the sheer weirdness of this story. A father devouring his children, a mother tricking him with a rock, a baby hidden in a cave, crying under the clang of shields. These aren't just wild details for shock value. They reflect something deep in human imagination. The ancient Greeks were telling a story about fear, about cycles of power, about how every generation rises to challenge the one before. Cronus overthrew his father, Uranus. Zeus would overthrow Cronus, and someday the cycle might continue again. Power in this world is never safe. It's always slipping, always shifting, always one child away from collapse. And so, with Zeus grown, his siblings freed, and his father weakened, the greatest cosmic drama of them all was ready to unfold. But that, my friends, is a tale for the next part, the war that shook the universe, when gods clashed in a storm of thunder, stone, and fury. For now, let's just take a breath and appreciate how one clever trick, a rock wrapped in swaddling cloth, saved the future king of Olympus, and how the fate of the cosmos turned on the paranoia of one very dysfunctional dad. When we last left off, Cronus had just lost his lunch, literally, and out came a full team of Olympian siblings. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia were back in the world, no longer trapped in their father's gut. That alone would have been dramatic enough, but this wasn't a family that just held grudges quietly. No, this was a family ready to fight, and their fight would shake the entire cosmos. This is the Titanomachy, the 10-year war that decided who would rule everything. 10 years might not sound like much by human standards, but in mythic time, it was an eternity of clashing mountains, shattering skies, and battles that made even the earth groan under the weight of gods. Zeus didn't waste any time once his siblings were free. He had grown up knowing his father had swallowed every brother and sister before him. That kind of childhood bedtime story, "Don't cry, or Dad will eat you," leaves a mark. For Zeus, it meant destiny. He wasn't going to let Cronus keep his throne. The first move was securing allies. Because even though the Olympians were divine, they were still young compared to the Titans. Cronus had his brothers and sisters on his side, ancient, enormous beings who had been ruling since time began. Zeus needed more than just his freed siblings. He needed an army. And that's where some of the strangest characters in Greek mythology come in. Deep beneath the earth, imprisoned by Cronus long ago, lived the Hecatonchires, 3 terrifying giants with 100 hands each. Imagine 3 beings who could hurl 100 boulders at once, clap thunder louder than Zeus's own storms, and crush mountains like sandcastles. Alongside them were the Cyclopes, massive one-eyed smiths who forged weapons no mortal, and no Titan, could withstand. The Olympians freed them. It was like unlocking a cheat code in a video game. The Cyclopes, grateful for their freedom, became the divine blacksmiths of the rebellion. They crafted weapons so powerful they practically defined the gods forever after. For Zeus, they made lightning bolts, jagged streaks of pure destruction that could split the sky in half. For Poseidon, they built a trident that could stir the seas, summon storms. and shake the ground itself. For Hades, they forged the helm of darkness, a crown that let him vanish completely, moving unseen like a shadow across the battlefield. It was a full-blown divine arsenal. Imagine being Cronus and seeing your once powerless children suddenly armed to the teeth with world-shattering weapons. That paranoia he'd had all along. Turns out, he was right to be worried, but Cronus wasn't going down without a fight. He called on his siblings, the Titans, the older generation of gods. They were massive, ancient forces of nature. Think of them less as individuals and more as walking natural disasters. Oceanus, the endless river that encircled the world. Hyperion, the shining titan of the sun. Coeus and Crius, symbols of cosmic order and strength. Some titans stayed neutral, but enough rallied to Cronus's side to make the war a true clash of generations. On one side the old order, ancient, vast, terrifying in its size and might. On the other the upstarts, young, ambitious, armed with new weapons, and fueled by the kind of anger only kids with a terrible father could muster. The war didn't end in a single battle. It stretched on for 10 long years, each side refusing to yield. Imagine the sky constantly split with lightning, the seas roaring in fury, mountains trembling as giants hurled boulders like pebbles. Mortals hadn't even really entered the scene yet, but if you'd been a human watching from the sidelines, you'd have thought the world itself was ending. The Olympians fought from Mount Olympus, their base of power. The Titans fought from Mount Othrys, their stronghold in central Greece. It was mountain against mountain, storm against stone, chaos echoing across the cosmos. Zeus hurled thunderbolts that scorched the earth. Poseidon swung his trident and caused earthquakes so violent they split valleys and sunk coastlines. Hades vanished into shadows, striking from the dark, unseen. Meanwhile, the 100-handed giants unleashed their fury, pelting the Titans with a storm of boulders, 50 from each hand, a constant hail no shield could withstand. And Cronus, he fought with sheer Titan strength, wielding the sickle that had once cut down his own father. The battle wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. This was about the cycle of power, the endless loop of sons overthrowing fathers, of new gods replacing old ones. At first, the war seemed evenly matched. The Titans had age, size, and raw power on their side. The Olympians had new weapons and fiery ambition. But the balance tipped when the Olympians leaned on strategy and their monstrous allies. The 100-handed giants, once freed, proved unstoppable. While the Titans hurled mountains, the giants hurled them back threefold. Imagine 3 colossal figures, each with arms like forests, grabbing whole ranges and tossing them as casually as stones into a pond. The battlefield became a wasteland of shattered peaks and smoking craters. Zeus's leadership mattered too. Say what you will about his personal flaws later, and trust me, there are plenty. But in this war, he proved himself a commander. His thunderbolts weren't just destructive, they were decisive. He could strike at the right time, break a Titan's charge, or light up the battlefield in ways that turned fear into momentum. Poseidon's fury kept the ground itself unstable under the Titan's feet, while Hades's helmet let him slip behind enemy lines, sowing panic in their ranks. Finally, the Olympians gained the upper hand. Zeus unleashed his full power, lightning after lightning, a storm so relentless it made even the Titans falter. Poseidon's trident split Cronus's defenses, while the 100-handed giants buried their enemies under avalanches of stone. The Titanomachy ended not with a whimper, but with a thunderous crash. The old gods were defeated. What do you do with enemies who are too powerful to kill? The Olympians had an answer: lock them away. The Titans who had sided with Cronus were hurled down into Tartarus, a dark, cavernous abyss deeper than even Hades's underworld. Imagine the worst dungeon possible, guarded by the 100-handed giants themselves. The Titans, once rulers of the cosmos, were now prisoners in eternal darkness. Cronus himself, the myths vary. Some say he was banished to Tartarus along with his allies. Others say he slipped away, fading into obscurity, or even went on to rule a mythical paradise called the Isles of the Blessed. But one thing was certain: his reign was over. For the Olympians, victory meant a new world order. No longer were the Titans in charge. Zeus and his siblings were now the rulers of the cosmos, each destined to take a piece of it. The war had shaken everything: the sky, the seas, the earth itself, and from that chaos emerged a new hierarchy of gods. The Titanomachy isn't just a flashy battle story, though it certainly has all the drama of a Hollywood blockbuster. It's about generational change. The old gods, the Titans, represented a more primal, chaotic universe, vast, untamed, and harsh. The Olympians, for all their flaws, represented a step toward a world that mortals could connect with. They were more human in their personalities: jealous, loving, angry, playful. Their reign wasn't perfect, but it was closer to the lives and emotions of the people who told their stories. The war also set the stage for every myth that followed. Without it, Zeus wouldn't be king of the sky, Poseidon wouldn't command the seas, Hades wouldn't rule the underworld, and all the stories of gods meddling in mortal lives, of heroes seeking divine favor, of tragedies and triumphs, none of them would exist without this violent, decade-long family feud. So, after 10 years of thunder and stone, the Olympians stood victorious. The Titans were chained in Tartarus, their old order broken. The sky was clearer, the seas calmer, the earth steady again. But peace never lasts long in Greek mythology. The brothers Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades still had to decide who got what piece of the universe. And let's just say, when siblings divide up an inheritance, it's never smooth sailing, but that's for the next chapter. For now, the war was over. The universe had survived its greatest upheaval, and a new era had begun. The age of the Olympians. The dust had barely settled from the Titanomachy. Imagine it: mountains toppled, seas boiled, the sky still crackling with leftover thunder. The old gods were chained deep in Tartarus, and for the first time, the young Olympians stood in control of the cosmos. Victory tasted sweet, but it also left behind a rather practical problem. Who exactly was in charge of what? It's one thing to overthrow your paranoid dad. It's another to decide who gets the keys to the universe afterward. And that's where our three famous brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, come in. The gods might have been immortal, but they still had to deal with the very human problem of splitting an inheritance. The universe was vast. There was the endless stretch of sky, the rolling seas that wrapped the earth, and the dark, mysterious underworld where all souls eventually drifted. Someone had to take each domain, but how do you decide? If you were expecting a civilized family meeting with a whiteboard and polite votes, let me stop you right there. These were Greek gods. Logic wasn't always their strong suit. Instead, they turned to chance. A lottery, nothing says. Trust between brothers, quite like tossing dice to see who rules the cosmos. The lot was cast, and Zeus, the youngest and the one who led the rebellion, drew the grand prize, the sky. It was fitting. He already had lightning bolts fresh from the Cyclopes, and he had proven himself as a commander in the war. Now he was king of the heavens, ruler of the clouds, the storms, the thunder, and the seat of Olympus itself. Being the king of the sky wasn't just about weather, though. It came with authority. Zeus became the chief god, the one who enforced oaths, upheld justice, and decided the fate of both gods and mortals. If you prayed to the heavens, you were praying to him. From the lofty height of Olympus, he could look down on the world and claim it was all under his watch. Of course, as we'll see later, Zeus wasn't exactly the world's most consistent king. He could be wise and protective one moment, then impulsive and scandalous the next. But at this moment, standing on the smoking battlefield after victory, Zeus looked every bit the part of the ruler. Thunderbolts in hand, sky stretching endlessly above him, he was the king of the gods. Poseidon, the middle brother, pulled the next domain, the sea. And honestly, it suited him perfectly. If Zeus was the storm in the sky, Poseidon was the storm in the water. With his trident, he could stir up whirlpools, summon tsunamis, and shake the earth with earthquakes. His title wasn't just god of the sea. He was also called the Earth Shaker. The Greeks were a seafaring people. and they understood just how powerful and unpredictable the ocean could be. One moment calm and glittering under the sun, the next a raging tempest that could swallow ships whole. That was Poseidon in a nutshell: unpredictable, temperamental, but also vital for survival. He wasn't just a scary figure, though. Sailors prayed to him for safe voyages, fishermen offered sacrifices for a good catch, and cities built temples along the coast in his honor. And there's something fascinating about his association with horses, too. The Greeks saw horses, wild, powerful, barely tamed, as kindred spirits of the sea. A galloping herd sounded like thunder, waves crashing on the shore looked like hooves pounding the earth. To Poseidon, horses and waves were two sides of the same wild, uncontainable force. So, while Zeus reigned above, Poseidon ruled everything wet, from sparkling springs to the deepest oceans. And let me tell you, he relished that power. Then there was Hades the eldest. His lot was the underworld, the realm of the dead. Now, to modern ears, that might sound like the short straw, and in some ways it was. Who really wants to be in charge of a gloomy kingdom full of shadows and wailing souls? But here's the twist: Hades' realm was far more than just a pit of despair. The underworld wasn't hell. It was simply where every soul went after death, good or bad, rich or poor. Hades presided over a vast, complex domain with different regions: the peaceful fields of Asphodel for ordinary souls, the dark Tartarus for the wicked, and the shining Elysium for heroes and the blessed. He was less a tyrant and more a cosmic manager, making sure souls didn't wander where they weren't supposed to. And here's the part people often forget: Hades wasn't just the god of death. He was also the god of hidden wealth. Beneath the earth lay fertile soil for crops and rich veins of gold, silver, and gems. His Roman name, Pluto, literally means the wealthy one. So yes, while his brothers got the flashy sky and the roaring seas, Hades quietly ended up controlling all the buried treasure and much of the cycle of life and death itself. Not a bad consolation prize, really. Still, he wasn't exactly the life of the party. While Zeus sat on Olympus and Poseidon roared through the waves, Hades stayed in the shadows, grim and reserved. Mortals rarely built temples for him. Not because they didn't respect him, but because they didn't want to attract his attention. He was like that serious uncle you nod politely to but never, ever want to sit next to at dinner. And just like that, the universe was divided. Zeus took the heavens. Poseidon commanded the seas. Hades ruled the underworld. It wasn't a neat democracy, of course. Zeus was still considered king overall, the first among equals, the one whose word carried the most weight. But each brother had immense, unquestionable power over his domain. This division shaped everything that followed. Whenever sailors feared a storm, they called on Poseidon. Whenever a soul left the world of the living, it passed into Hades' realm. And whenever a mortal swore an oath under the open sky, it was Zeus who watched to see if they kept their word. The Greeks loved this idea of balance. Three brothers dividing up the cosmos like a pie. Sky, sea, and underworld. Life, death, and everything in between. It gave order to a chaotic universe. But it also gave us endless drama, because gods with clear boundaries don't stay in their lanes for long. If you've ever grown up with siblings, you know how this works. Just because you've drawn lots and agreed on who gets what doesn't mean the rivalry stops. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were no different. Zeus liked to act as the boss, reminding everyone he was the king. Poseidon, proud and quick-tempered, sometimes bristled at taking orders. More than once, he joined conspiracies against his brother on Olympus. Hades, for his part, didn't care much about Olympus politics, but when it came to his underworld, he was fiercely protective. You didn't mess with his domain without consequences. This tension meant that even after the war ended, the family drama never really stopped. The universe had order, but it also had constant undercurrents of rivalry and suspicion. And in Greek mythology, that usually meant more chaos was on the way. It's wild when you think about it. The most important division of power in mythology came down to chance. A lottery. The Greeks loved this detail. because it reflected something they believed about the world. That fate, chance, and divine randomness shaped everything. Kings could fall, farmers could rise, storms could wreck ships or spare them, and no one really had control over how the dice landed. Even the gods, in their stories, weren't immune to fate's hand. And yet, that lottery created a structure that lasted for ages. Every myth that followed, from Zeus's countless affairs, to Poseidon's quarrels with heroes, to Hades's fateful abduction of Persephone, all flowed from this one moment of chance. So here we are, the Titans defeated, the universe divided, the three brothers ruling their realms. For mortals, this new order brought both fear and reassurance. You knew who to pray to when the sky darkened, when the seas raged, or when a loved one passed into shadow. The gods were terrifying, yes, but they were also familiar now. They had roles, responsibilities, even personalities mortals could recognize. But as we'll see next, the calm of this arrangement was deceptive. Zeus might have been king of the sky, but he was also a walking soap opera. His side projects, as we'll politely call them, created ripple effects that shaped myths for centuries. From lovers turned into constellations to children who became heroes or monsters, his personal life was the real storm. The universe might have been divided, but the drama, that was just beginning. So far, we've seen Zeus as the bold rebel who overthrew his paranoid father. We've seen him as the king of the sky, lightning bolts in hand, standing victorious after the Titanomachy. On paper, he should have been the perfect ruler, a wise god who brought justice and order to the universe. But here's the thing, Zeus was a lot of things. Wise, sometimes. Powerful? Absolutely. Responsible? Well, not so much. If the cosmic lottery gave him the sky, his personal life gave him chaos, because Zeus wasn't just king of the gods. He was also the original drama magnet. And by drama, I mean romantic entanglements. Lots of them. Let's be honest, when you're the most powerful being in the universe, temptation is everywhere. For Zeus, temptation meant not only goddesses, but also nymphs, mortals, and in some stories, even the occasional creative disguise involving animals. Yes, animals. If you've ever heard the phrase, Greek mythology gets weird, it almost always leads back to Zeus's love life. His marriage to Hera, the goddess of marriage itself, should have been the picture of stability. She was queen of the gods, regal, commanding, and every bit his equal in power. Together, they should have been the ultimate divine power couple. Instead, their marriage was like a centuries-long soap opera, full of infidelity, jealousy, revenge, and some very unfortunate mortals caught in the crossfire. Zeus's affairs weren't just numerous, they were bizarrely inventive. To get close to mortals or avoid Hera's suspicion, he transformed himself into different forms. A swan in one of the most famous myths, Zeus turned into a swan to pursue Leda, a mortal queen. Out of this union came not only children, but also Helen of Troy. Yes, the Helen whose beauty would later spark the Trojan War. So, one of the greatest conflicts in mythology basically started with Zeus doing bird cosplay. A bull, then there's Europa, a Phoenician princess. Zeus appeared to her as a magnificent white bull, gentle and striking. When she climbed onto his back, he charged into the sea and carried her all the way to Crete. From their union came Minos, a king whose own myths would spiral into labyrinths, minotaurs, and tragedy. A golden shower, and no, not the kind you're thinking of. Danag, the mother of Perseus, was kept locked in a bronze chamber by her paranoid father, who feared a prophecy. Zeus bypassed the locks by descending as a stream of golden rain that fell into her lap. Out of this miraculous encounter came Perseus, the hero who would one day slay Medusa. An eagle, a cloud, a flame, the list goes on. When Zeus wanted someone, he got creative. And usually, the result wasn't just scandal. It was a child destined for greatness or disaster. And oh boy, were there children. Zeus fathered an almost overwhelming number of offspring, with goddesses, mortals, and nymphs alike. Each child came with a story, and often those stories became cornerstones of Greek mythology. Athena, one of his most famous daughters, Her birth was unusual even by Olympian standards. Fearing a prophecy that her mother Metis would bear a child who could overthrow him, Zeus swallowed Metis whole while she was pregnant. Later, Zeus developed a splitting headache, and when Hephaestus cracked his skull open with an axe, out sprang Athena, fully grown, fully armored, and ready to lecture everyone. Apollo and Artemis with the goddess Leto, Zeus fathered the divine twins. Apollo would become god of music, prophecy, and the sun, while Artemis would rule the hunt and the moon. Their story is full of divine rivalries and mortal encounters, many of which were sparked by Hera's anger at Leto. Hercules, a Hercules, perhaps the most famous of Zeus's mortal children. Born to a human woman, Alcmene, Heracles' entire life was shaped by Hera's jealousy. She sent serpents to kill him as a baby, cursed him with madness, and set him impossible labors. Yet he endured them all, and became one of the greatest heroes in myth. Perseus, remember Danag and the Golden Rain. Their son, Perseus, would go on to slay Medusa and rescue Andromeda. Another hero whose life began with Zeus's questionable approach to romance. Helen of Troy, Minos, Dionysus, Hermes, the Muses, the list goes on and on. If you've heard of a Greek hero, there's a good chance Zeus is lurking somewhere in their family tree. Zeus's children weren't just side characters. They shaped myths, founded cities, led wars, and inspired cults. In a way, his affairs weren't just personal indulgences, they were mythological world-building. Each child became another thread in the tapestry of Greek storytelling. Now, you can't talk about Zeus's escapades without talking about Hera. Imagine being the goddess of marriage, your very job being to uphold fidelity and loyalty, while your husband is out here turning into swans and rain clouds to chase women. Hera's rage wasn't just jealousy, it was humiliation. And she took it out not only on Zeus, but often on the women involved. And especially their children. Turned into a cow. Callisto transformed into a bear. Leto harassed as she tried to give birth. Heracles tormented his whole life. Hera's fury was legendary, and while we can feel sympathy for her, it's hard not to notice how often her punishments landed on mortals who never asked to be part of Zeus's schemes. This constant back and forth, Zeus pursuing lovers, Hera punishing them, became one of the main engines of Greek mythology. Their toxic marriage fueled stories for centuries, shaping not only the gods but also the lives of mortals caught in the divine crossfire. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of Zeus's love life, but for the ancient Greeks, these myths had weight. They explained the origins of heroes, the founding of cities, even natural phenomena. When they told stories about Zeus's affairs, they weren't just gossiping about divine scandals. They were weaving explanations for why the world was the way it was. At the same time, these stories reflect a truth the Greeks understood well: power often comes with chaos. Zeus was king of the gods, but his inability to control his desires showed that even the most powerful being in the universe was flawed. In fact, that was the whole point. The gods weren't perfect. They were reflections of human strengths and weaknesses, magnified to cosmic scale. Because of Zeus's endless side projects, entire lineages of heroes were created, entire myths spiraled out of a single union, and each time the consequences rippled outward, wars began. Quests unfolded, monsters were born, families crumbled. It wasn't just a love life. It was a divine butterfly effect. Zeus's choices, or lack of control, reshaped the mythological world again and again. And while the stories were often tragic, they were also deeply human, because who hasn't seen how one person's choices can ripple through generations? So here we have Zeus the king, the lawgiver, the thunder wielder, but also the serial philanderer, whose affairs shaped half the myths you've ever heard. He was both the protector of justice and the cause of endless injustice. A cosmic contradiction wrapped in a toga, and while his adventures made for endless stories, they also sat up the next chapter, because for every one of Zeus's projects, there was Hera, furious, waiting, plotting. And if you think Zeus was dramatic, just wait until we dive into Hera's side of the story. Her wrath wasn't just anger, it was strategy. It was power of its own. But we'll get to that. For now, remember this: Zeus may have ruled the sky, but when it came to his heart, or perhaps his impulses, he was the storm. If Zeus was the storm, then Hera was the thunder that followed. She wasn't just a background character in his wild tales. She was queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage, and one of the most powerful figures in Greek mythology. But when your husband is Zeus, the same Zeus who can't walk past a mortal village without turning into a swan, bull, or mysterious golden mist, your story is bound to be complicated. So let's step into Hera's world. A world of loyalty betrayed, dignity defended, and fury so sharp it could outlast eternity. On paper, Hera should have had the perfect role. She wasn't just Zeus's wife, she was his sister too, because, well, mythology has a way of keeping it in the family. Their union was supposed to symbolize the sacred bond of marriage. Gods and mortals alike were meant to look up to them as the divine model of partnership, fidelity, and trust. But if marriage is supposed to be built on trust, theirs was built on lightning bolts and excuses. Zeus strayed constantly, and Hera's pain was legendary. Imagine being the goddess of marriage and family, tasked with protecting unions and upholding loyalty, while your own husband treated fidelity like an optional side quest. That contradiction alone gave Hera's story its fire. Now, Hera wasn't the type to quietly suffer. She had power, and she used it. The tragedy, and maybe the injustice, is that she rarely aimed her anger at Zeus directly. After all, he was the king of the gods. Instead, she unleashed her fury on the women he pursued, and all too often, on the children who resulted from those unions. I, a mortal priestess loved by Zeus. To hide her from Hera, Zeus turned her into a cow. Hera saw right through the disguise and wasn't about to let it go. She sent a gadfly to endlessly sting you, driving her across the world in torment. Echo, a mountain nymph who got on Hera's bad side because she distracted her with chatter while Zeus went off on one of his adventures. Hera cursed her so that she could only repeat the last words spoken to her, a silenced voice reduced to an echo. Hercules, probably the most famous victim of Hera's rage. From the moment of his birth, Hera hounded him. She sent serpents to his crib, cursed him with madness, and set him impossible labors, hoping each one would be his last. Yet Hercules endured, and ironically, his greatest feats were forged by her relentless persecution. The list goes on. Women turned into animals, children cursed with tragic fates, families shattered not because they defied Hera, but because they were unlucky enough to attract Zeus's wandering eye. Why? You might be wondering, why didn't Hera just take it all out on Zeus? Great question. Part of it is mythology's double standard. Zeus was king, the untouchable patriarch of Olympus. To attack him directly would have meant open rebellion, and Hera knew that power, once tested head-on, could crush even her. But that didn't mean she was powerless. Hera fought differently. Her fury was strategic, sharp, and long-lasting. She couldn't overthrow Zeus, but she could make every single one of his side adventures feel like a disaster. Her revenge was often indirect, but it was devastating. And honestly, can you blame her? Imagine being humiliated over and over, not in private, but in front of gods, mortals, even entire cities. Hera's rage wasn't just about jealousy, it was about dignity. About a woman forced to uphold marriage as sacred while her own was dragged through the mud. But here's where things get interesting. Hera wasn't just the furious wife. That's the shallow version of her story. The Greeks also saw her as a protector, a goddess of immense importance in everyday life. She was invoked at weddings to bless unions. Women prayed to her for safe childbirth. Entire cities dedicated temples to her, Argos and Samos especially. In fact, the temple of Hera on Samos, the Heraion, was once one of the largest in the world. Imagine walking into a space so grand it rivaled the Parthenon, filled with pillars, offerings, and priests devoted to her. She even had her own festival games, the Heraion Games, held at Olympia, where young women competed in running races in her honor. It was like the Olympics, but for women, centuries before anyone thought of gender equality as a concept. Hera wasn't just a goddess of vengeance. She was also a goddess of power, dignity, and social order. That's what makes Hera fascinating. She was both a victim and a force of nature. On one hand, she endured a marriage that constantly humiliated her. On the other, she stood as queen of the gods, worshipped, respected, and feared. This paradox, power mixed with pain, gave her a depth that made her stories resonate. People could see themselves in her struggles: betrayed spouses, wronged partners, women forced to carry dignity in the face of disrespect. Yet she also represented the ultimate authority, the divine embodiment of what marriage should be. The Greeks didn't resolve that contradiction. They lived with it, just like Hera did. Every so often, though Hera did take a direct stand against Zeus, there's a famous story of how she conspired with other Olympians, Poseidon, Athena, and Apollo, to overthrow him. They managed to bind him with chains while he slept. For a moment, it looked like the king of the gods was about to be dethroned by his own wife and siblings. But Thetis, a sea goddess, summoned the 100-handed giant Briareus to rescue Zeus. With his help, Zeus broke free, and his wrath was terrible. Hera was punished, suspended from the sky with golden chains, humiliated before all of Olympus. She wept, and though Zeus eventually released her, the memory of that rebellion hung in the air. It showed that even the queen of the gods had limits. She could challenge Zeus, but never truly defeat him. And so her anger continued to flow in other directions, shaping countless myths with her vengeance and her grief. Why do her stories matter so much? Because Hera wasn't just a goddess. She was a mirror of human experience. She was flawed, emotional, fierce, and enduring. She embodied the pain of betrayal, the struggle to maintain dignity, and the determination to wield power, even when the deck was stacked against you. The Greeks told stories of her fury not just to explain why Hercules had to suffer or why certain nymphs became cows or bears. They told them because they recognized something universal in her rage. They saw the way hurt and dignity can twist together, the way love and resentment can live in the same heart. Hera's fury wasn't random. It was focused, deliberate, and lasting, and that made her one of the most feared and respected figures in all mythology. So when you think of Hera, don't just picture the jealous wife storming after her husband's lovers. Picture the queen of Olympus crowned, radiant, commanding temples that stretched higher than any mortal palace. Picture the goddess women prayed to when their lives depended on it. Picture the paradox, power and pain, fury and dignity. Because Hera was never just a supporting character in Zeus's messy love life. She was the storm that followed him, the queen who never stopped fighting to hold her place, even when the world, and her husband, seemed determined to humiliate her. And if Zeus was the king of contradictions, Hera was his match. Together they created not only endless drama, but also the balance of fear and reverence that defined the Olympian pantheon. But the story doesn't pause here, because while Zeus and Hera were wrestling with their marriage, other gods represented different sides of the human experience. Nowhere was this clearer than on the battlefield. Two gods, siblings, rivals, stood for two very different visions of war itself. On one side, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy. On the other, Ares, the god of bloodlust and chaos. Together, they showed how the Greeks themselves wrestled with what war meant, noble duty or senseless slaughter. And that's where we're headed next. When you think of war, what comes to mind? For some, it's clashing swords, shouting soldiers, blood and smoke on the battlefield. For others, it's planning maps spread across tables, careful strategies, and clever maneuvers that win the day with minimal losses. The ancient Greeks understood both sides, and they embodied them in two gods, Athena and Ares. They weren't just siblings, they were two completely different visions of what war meant. One was thoughtful and strategic, the other raw and violent. Together, they gave the Greeks a way to understand both the glory and the horror of battle. Let's start with Athena. Born in one of the weirdest ways imaginable, She sprang fully grown and fully armed from the forehead of Zeus after he swallowed her pregnant mother, Metis. If that origin doesn't tell you she was destined to be different, nothing will. From her first moment, she represented clarity, intelligence, and precision. Athena wasn't about brute force. She was about control. Picture her not in the middle of a bloody melee, but in a war council, pointing to the map, already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. She was the goddess of strategy, the protector of cities, the one you'd want advising you if you ever had to fight against overwhelming odds. She didn't just inspire soldiers, she guided heroes. Odysseus, the trickster who thought up the Trojan horse. He had Athena's wisdom whispering in his ear. Perseus, who slayed Medusa. He had Athena's shield in his hand. Her role was always the same, providing the clarity, the cunning, and the guidance to turn desperate fights into victories. She even had a soft spot for crafts, especially weaving, which might sound out of place until you realize that for her, weaving was just another battlefield. Patterns, precision, patience. It was all strategy, whether with thread or with swords. Athena represented the Greeks' ideal of war: defensive, rational, and controlled. War fought not for blood, but for survival and order. Now let's swing to the other side, Ares. If Athena was the chess player, Ares was the bar brawler. He didn't think, he charged. He wasn't interested in strategy or honor. He was about chaos, the screaming, bloody madness of battle where swords crash and men fall without knowing why. The Greeks feared Ares more than they loved him. Even Zeus, his own father, once called him the most hateful of all the gods. Think about that when your dad is Zeus, and even he thinks you're too much. You know you've got issues. Ares thrived on violence for its own sake. He loved the roar of combat, the smell of blood, the terror in soldiers' eyes. His sons were literally named Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror, the personifications of panic on the battlefield. Wherever Ares showed up, you could bet things were about to get ugly. And unlike Athena, Ares wasn't exactly a winner. He lost more fights than he won. In the Iliad, he charges into battle only to be wounded and sent running back to Olympus, whining to Zeus like a sulking child. The Greeks respected his power, but they didn't admire him. He represented everything about war. They hated its waste, its bloodshed, its destruction. What's fascinating is how these two siblings reflected Greek values. The Greeks admired cunning and restraint. They built their heroes, like Odysseus or Theseus, not just on strength, but on intelligence. That's Athena's influence. War, in their eyes, should be something guided, something precise, something that protected rather than destroyed. Ares, on the other hand, was a reminder of what happens when war goes wrong, when armies lose control, when fear and rage take over. He wasn't honored in Athens with grand temples. He wasn't celebrated with festivals like Dionysus or Apollo. His cult was small, his reputation tainted. He was necessary, yes, war was part of life, but he was also dangerous, a force better kept at arm's length. This distinction even shows up when you compare Greek and Roman culture. The Romans took Ares, renamed him Mars, and completely rebranded him. To them, Mars was disciplined, noble, even fatherly, the protector of Rome itself. But the Greeks, they kept Ares as he was: chaotic, destructive, and kind of embarrassing at family gatherings. Stories often pit Athena and Ares against each other, not just as gods but as ideals. In myths and in the Iliad, Athena consistently outsmarts or defeats Ares, showing that intelligence will outlast brute strength. When Ares stormed into battle, Athena would hold him off, proving that fury without foresight is doomed to fail. It wasn't just sibling rivalry, it was philosophy. Two views of war, fighting not only on the battlefield but in the Greek imagination. What makes this pair so fascinating is how human they feel. Anyone who has ever faced conflict knows these two forces. The urge to lash out, to fight with raw anger, to smash without thinking. That's Ares. The ability to pause, to think, to plan carefully. That's Athena. The Greeks didn't choose one over the other completely. They recognized both lived inside every soldier, every leader, every person. War wasn't just strategy or chaos, it was both, locked in constant struggle. And by personifying them as gods, they gave shape to that inner battle. Imagine a battlefield. On one side, warriors stand in disciplined lines, shields locked, following orders with precision. That's Athena's influence. War as an art, controlled and purposeful. On the other side, warriors break ranks, screaming, charging blindly into the fray, swinging wildly in rage. That's Ares's domain. The frenzy, the fire, the part of war that terrifies even those who fight. The truth is both sides are always there. Every battle, every war, carries both Athena's calm logic and Ares's reckless fire. Athena and Ares weren't just about war. They were about choices. They asked the Greeks, and us, listening centuries later, what kind of fight we want to wage. Do we storm blindly into conflict, fueled by anger, or do we step back, plan, and use our strength with wisdom? That's why their myths linger, because even though the gods are gone, those questions remain. In every argument, in every challenge, in every decision, those two voices are still with us, the strategist and the brute. So as we leave the battlefield behind, we've seen how the Greeks understood conflict through two very different gods. Athena, wise and strategic, the kind of warrior you'd trust to lead you through the darkest night. Ares, furious and chaotic, the kind of warrior you'd fear more than the enemy. But war wasn't everything in Greek mythology. Love, craft, and quick wit had their place too. And if you thought Zeus's love life was messy, just wait until we meet the goddess of beauty, the god of the forge, and the trickster with winged sandals. Because up next, we're stepping away from the battlefield and into a new kind of chaos, the kind that comes from desire, creativity, and speed. We've seen the thunder of Zeus, the fury of Hera, and the clash between Athena and Ares. But the Greek pantheon wasn't all about war and storms. It was also about love, beauty, clever tricks, and even the dignity of hard work. In this part of the story, we're meeting three very different gods: Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire; Hephaestus, god of the forge and craftsmanship; and Hermes, the wing-footed trickster and messenger. Together, they brought a completely different kind of energy to Olympus. Not the heavy drama of war, but the unpredictable chaos of love, invention, and wit. Let's start with Aphrodite, because really, how could we not? She was the goddess of love, desire, and beauty, and her presence in the pantheon changed everything. Now, her origin story is one of the strangest in all mythology. In one version, she's the daughter of Zeus and a goddess named Dione. That's the neat and tidy, family-friendly version. But the older, more infamous version comes from Hesiod's Theogony. According to that tale, Cronus, the same Cronus who swallowed his children, castrated his father Uranus, threw the severed, let's say, equipment, into the sea, and from the foam that bubbled up, Aphrodite was born. The goddess of love rising out of cosmic violence. It's about as Greek mythology as it gets. Whichever version you believe, one thing is clear: Aphrodite was breathtaking. Her beauty wasn't just physical, it was magnetic. Mortals and gods alike lost their heads in her presence. To the Greeks, she represented the irresistible pull of desire, the way love can make even the wisest person do ridiculous things. She had a magical girdle, the cestus, which made her utterly irresistible. But honestly, she didn't need it. She could sway hearts with a glance. Wars were started for her, literally, as we'll see later with the Trojan War. She wasn't just beautiful, she was dangerous. Aphrodite's influence wasn't the soft, romantic love of candlelit dinners. No, it was the messy, uncontrollable passion that changes lives overnight. If you've ever seen someone fall in love too fast with exactly the wrong person, that's Aphrodite at work. Her affairs were legendary. Though she was married to Hephaestus, she famously preferred the company of Ares. Their affair became one of the most embarrassing scandals on Olympus when Hephaestus caught them in an unbreakable net and displayed them to the other gods. Imagine an entire divine audience watching, laughing, gossiping. Even gods had reality TV-worthy drama. But beyond the affairs, Aphrodite's power was more profound. She represented the force of attraction that binds people together, the spark that starts stories, for better or worse. Where Athena stood for strategy and order, Aphrodite stood for passion and unpredictability, and the Greeks understood that both forces were just as important. Now let's move to Hephaestus, almost the opposite of Aphrodite in every way. If she was all beauty and desire, Hephaestus was grit and labor. He was the god of fire, metalwork, and craftsmanship. His story was tragic from the start. In one version, Hera threw him off Mount Olympus because she was ashamed of his deformity. In another, Zeus tossed him down after a family argument. Either way, he landed hard, leaving him with a limp that never healed. Unlike the other shining, glamorous Olympians, Hephaestus was marked by struggle. But he turned that pain into strength. He became the divine blacksmith, working at his forge day and night. He built palaces, weapons, and wonders for the gods. Zeus's thunderbolts. Hephaestus made them. Poseidon's trident, that was his work too. The armor of Achilles, the magical shield of Athena, even the chains that once held Prometheus, all forged by Hephaestus. He was brilliant, indispensable, and yet often overlooked. While the other gods played their power games, he worked, quietly shaping the very tools that allowed them to shine. And yet, his marriage to Aphrodite was a cruel twist. She was the goddess of irresistible love. He was the god of fire and craft, mocked for his limp. The pairing was never fair, and her affair with Ares was salt in the wound. But Hephaestus wasn't powerless. He got his revenge not through violence but through craft. That infamous net that humiliated Aphrodite and Ares was his masterpiece of passive-aggressive genius. Hephaestus showed that power didn't always come from beauty or brute strength. Sometimes it came from skill, patience, and the ability to outsmart even the gods with iron and fire. And then there's Hermes. If Aphrodite was beauty and Hephaestus was craft, Hermes was speed, wit, and mischief. The moment he was born, he was already causing trouble. According to myth, as a newborn, he crawled out of his crib, stole Apollo's cattle, invented the lyre out of a tortoise shell, and snuck back into bed before anyone noticed. That was day one. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, the one with winged sandals who could move between worlds. But he wasn't just a delivery boy. He was the god of travelers, merchants, thieves, and storytellers. He represented the fast-talking, quick-thinking energy that could charm, persuade, or deceive. Mortals prayed to him for safe journeys, for good business deals, and sometimes for a little extra luck in bending the rules. He was clever, flexible, and above all, likable. Even when he caused trouble, people forgave him because he embodied the kind of mischievous charm that everyone secretly admires. He also had a tender side. As Psychopompos, he guided souls into the underworld, leading them gently into Hades' realm. Unlike the grim silence of death, Hermes made the transition feel less terrifying, as if you had a friend walking you home one last time. Together, these three gods represent something powerful about how the Greeks saw life. Aphrodite embodied love and desire, the force that drives people into relationships, wars, and poetry alike. Hephaestus embodied labor and skill, the dignity of craft and the creativity that builds civilizations. Hermes embodied wit, speed, and adaptability, the ability to survive in a world where rules bend and change. They weren't warriors like Ares, nor rulers like Zeus, nor guardians like Hera. But in their own ways, they shaped daily life just as much. Every time someone fell in love, every time a craftsman struck iron at his forge, every time a traveler set out on the road, these gods were there, and maybe that's why the Greeks wove them together in stories so often. Aphrodite, married to Hephaestus but in love with Ares, created endless drama. Hermes, always darting between gods, often played a role in smoothing things over or making them worse with a sly smile. Their myths remind us that life isn't just about war or power. It's about relationships, work, and the cleverness to navigate it all. The Greeks saw in these gods the everyday forces that shaped human lives, forces that were just as divine as thunderbolts or storms. So far, we've seen war, love, craft, and trickery. But mythology isn't only about gods who shine. Some of its most powerful stories are about grief, loss, and the way love can endure even in the darkest places. And that's where we're headed next, into the underworld, into the heartbreaking story of a mother and daughter, Demeter and Persephone, whose tale explains not just the seasons, but the cycles of life, death, and love itself. Not every myth from ancient Greece is about thunderbolts or battles. Some of the most powerful stories are quiet ones, about love, loss, and the ache of separation. Among all the tales of gods and heroes, none touched the Greeks more deeply than the story of Demeter and Persephone. It's a story about a mother and her daughter, about grief so deep it changes the world, and about how even in the land of the dead, love can still find a way. Let's start with Demeter. She wasn't flashy like Zeus or tempestuous like Poseidon or furious like Hera. She was steady, nurturing, life-giving. As the goddess of agriculture, grain, and fertility, she was the one who made sure crops grew, fruit ripened, and the earth gave food to mortals. Without Demeter, there was no bread, no harvest, no survival. The Greeks worshipped her quietly but reverently. She wasn't about drama, she was about life itself. Farmers made offerings before planting their fields. Towns held festivals when the harvest came in. She was the goddess who reminded people of the sacred bond between humans and the earth. And at the heart of her life was her daughter, Persephone. Persephone was light, laughter, and bloom. She was often pictured in meadows, surrounded by flowers, her hands full of blossoms. To Demeter, she wasn't just a daughter. She was everything. Her joy, her reason, her hope. But in myths, joy never lasts forever. One day, Persephone wandered into a field to pick flowers. The sun was warm, the air sweet, and she bent down to gather a narcissus, a flower that seemed brighter than all the rest. And that's when the earth split open. From the darkness below, Hades, the god of the underworld, Demeter's brother, rose in his black chariot, pulled by shadowy horses. He seized Persephone and dragged her down into his realm, the ground closing behind them. Imagine the silence that followed. One moment laughter, the next a yawning chasm, and a mother's daughter gone. When Demeter realized Persephone was missing, her sorrow shook the earth. She searched day and night, calling her daughter's name, wandering across mountains and seas. But Persephone was nowhere to be found. Her grief wasn't just personal, it became cosmic. Demeter refused to let the earth bear fruit. Crops withered, fields lay barren, trees stopped producing. The earth grew cold and lifeless. Mortals began to starve. Sacrifices to the gods dwindled. Even Olympus felt the weight of her sorrow. For the first time, the survival of both mortals and gods hung on the grief of one mother. Eventually, Demeter discovered the truth. Hades had taken Persephone to the underworld to be his queen. Furious, she demanded her daughter's return. But Hades refused. He loved Persephone and wanted her at his side. Zeus, caught between his brother and his sister, finally stepped in to negotiate. A compromise was struck. Persephone could return to Demeter, but only if she hadn't eaten anything in the underworld. It sounded like a loophole, but might save them all. But Persephone, in her loneliness, had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds. Just 6. But in the world of gods, even a taste bound her to the underworld. So the deal was this: Persephone would spend part of the year with Demeter, bringing life and bloom to the earth, and part of the year with Hades, ruling as queen of the underworld. And that's how the Greeks explained the seasons. When Persephone returned to her mother, Demeter's joy brought spring and summer, a time of growth and abundance. But when Persephone went back to Hades, Demeter's grief returned, and the world fell into autumn and winter, cold, barren, waiting for life to return. Every year, the earth itself reflected a mother's love and sorrow, life, death, and rebirth woven into the turning of the seasons. What's remarkable about Persephone is how she changed through this story. At first, she was just a flower child, innocent and carefree. But after her time in the underworld, she became something more. She wasn't just a victim. She was a queen. As Hades' wife, she ruled over the dead with calm authority. Mortals prayed to her for mercy, for gentle passage into the afterlife. She wasn't cruel like some gods of death in other cultures. She was quiet, dignified, and powerful in her own right. Persephone became a goddess of duality, both the bloom of spring and the shadow of death, both the child of Demeter and the queen of Hades. She embodied the truth the Greeks knew well, that life and death are bound together, and one cannot exist without the other. This myth wasn't just a story. It became the foundation for one of the most important religious rites in ancient Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries. Every year, initiates gathered near Athens to reenact the story of Demeter and Persephone. The details of the rituals were kept secret, so secret that we still don't know exactly what happened. But we do know this: those who took part believed the mysteries offered them hope. Hope that death was not the end. Hope that just as Persephone returned from the underworld, the soul might find renewal too. For over 2,000 years, this ritual was practiced, connecting generations of Greeks to the cycle of life and death, and to the love of a mother and her daughter. The tale of Demeter and Persephone isn't just mythology, it's poetry. It's the universal experience of loss and love, of separation and reunion. Every parent who has ever feared for their child, every child who has ever had to step into adulthood, every person who has ever mourned someone they love, they can see themselves in this story. It explains why the earth blooms and withers, but it also explains why the human heart breaks and heals. It's a myth about the seasons, but it's also about grief, transformation, and the way love stretches even into the realm of death. When the Greeks looked at barren winter fields, they didn't just see cold earth. They saw Demeter grieving for Persephone. When they saw the first flowers of spring, they saw the joy of reunion. The myth gave meaning to cycles they couldn't control, turning natural rhythms into a story of love. And maybe that's why this tale has lasted so long. Because it's not just about gods, it's about us. About the way life always moves between light and shadow, between loss and return. So far, we've seen storms, wars, and heartbreak. But mythology isn't done surprising us. Because not all gods were about order or sorrow, some were about breaking rules entirely, about wine, madness, and wild freedom that terrified the ancient Greeks almost as much as it fascinated them. And that's where we're going next, to Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, and the wild, untamed power he brought to the world. Up to this point, our journey has taken us through thunder and storms, jealous queens, brutal wars, and heartbreaking underworld bargains. Heavy stuff. But Greek mythology wasn't all sorrow and solemnity. Sometimes it was about letting go, about wine, laughter, dance, and the freedom to break every rule society tried to impose. And no god embodied that wild spirit better than Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, theatre, and ecstatic madness. He was the outsider who became one of the most beloved Olympians, and his story is as chaotic as the parties thrown in his honor. Dionysus didn't even arrive in the world normally. His beginnings were tangled in drama. His mother Semele was a mortal princess loved by Zeus. Hera, of course, wasn't thrilled. She tricked Semele into demanding that Zeus reveal his true godly form. Now, mortals can't handle the full radiance of a god, and when Zeus obliged, Semele was consumed in divine fire. But she was pregnant at the time, and Zeus, desperate to save the unborn child, did something only Zeus would think of. He sewed the baby into his own thigh. Months later, Dionysus was born from that strange womb. Yes, thigh pregnancy. In mythology, nothing is too weird. Because of this, Dionysus was sometimes called twice born, a symbol of rebirth and resilience. From his first breath, he was different, a mix of mortal and divine, a child of tragedy who would grow into a god of joy. When you think Dionysus, you think wine. And for the Greeks, wine wasn't just a drink, it was a miracle. Grapes harvested, crushed, fermented, turned into something that could transform mood, loosen tongues, and connect mortals to the divine. Dionysus wasn't just a patron of vineyards, he embodied what wine did to people. He was joy and liberation. He was the laughter that comes after the second cup, The songs sung too loudly, the truth spilled at midnight, but he was also the danger of excess, the chaos when a feast spirals out of control, when inhibitions vanish and frenzy takes over. That dual nature defined him. Wine could comfort or destroy, it could spark love or violence. And Dionysus was both sides at once. Dionysus wasn't always welcome among the gods. For a long time, he wandered an outsider, but his cult spread like wildfire among mortals, especially among those who lived on society's margins: women, slaves, foreigners, the poor. People who normally had no voice suddenly found freedom in his worship. The rituals of Dionysus were wild. His followers, known as Maenads, would run into the forests at night, dressed in animal skins, dancing to drums and flutes, until they fell into a frenzy. They carried tharsi, staffs tipped with ivy and pine cones, and were said to tear animals apart with their bare hands in fits of divine madness. To outsiders, it looked terrifying. To participants, it was liberation. For a few hours, they shed their roles, their burdens, their fears. They became something more than mortal. Dionysus's cult was radical because it broke down barriers. Women and men worshipped together. Slaves and free citizens joined in the same dance. In a society built on rigid order, his worship turned everything upside down. But Dionysus wasn't just about drunken chaos. He was also the god of theatre, storytelling, and masks. His festivals gave birth to Greek drama itself. Tragedies and comedies performed in his honor. Why theatre? Because like wine, theatre transformed. When you put on a mask, you became someone else. When you sat in the audience, you lost yourself in the story. For the Greeks, that was sacred. To step out of your own skin, to feel something bigger, to weep with strangers or laugh with them. That was Dionysus's gift. So when you think of Dionysus, don't just picture wine and wild dancing. Picture an amphitheater filled with thousands of people, gasping and crying together as a tragedy unfolds, or roaring with laughter at a comedy. That collective experience, that shared transformation, was divine madness too. For all his chaos, Dionysus wasn't a cruel god. Unlike Ares, who thrived on blood, or Hera, who thrived on vengeance, Dionysus often showed compassion, especially to the broken and the outcast. He gave joy to those who had none. He welcomed mortals who felt left out by the other gods. He even had a softer side in his myths. In one story, he rescued Ariadne, abandoned on the island of Naxos after helping Theseus defeat the Minotaur. Where Theseus betrayed her, Dionysus crowned her with stars, making her his immortal queen. That mix of wildness and tenderness made him unique. He could inspire madness, yes, but also healing. He was the god who reminded mortals that joy was sacred too. Still, not everyone welcomed him. Kings who tried to ban his cult often paid dearly. In one myth, King Pentheus of Thebes refused to acknowledge Dionysus. He mocked him, denied his divinity, and forbade his people to join his worship. Dionysus lured Pentheus into disguising himself as a woman to spy on the Maenads. Caught in their frenzy, they mistook him for a lion and tore him apart. The message was clear: deny Dionysus at your peril. His freedom might terrify you, but you couldn't ignore it. He was a god of paradox, gentle joy and violent frenzy, liberation and destruction, madness and clarity. What's striking is that Dionysus wasn't always considered one of the 12 Olympians. He was an outsider wandering the world, spreading his cult among mortals. But eventually, he forced his way into Olympus. The god of wine and madness became part of the divine council, sitting alongside Zeus, Hera, and the rest. And maybe that's fitting. Because Dionysus represented something the Greeks couldn't live without: joy, release, transformation. The reminder that sometimes you have to break the rules, dance in the woods, or lose yourself in a story to remember what it means to be alive. If you strip away the myths, Dionysus still speaks to something deeply human: the need for joy, the need to forget yourself sometimes, the need to step outside of rigid roles and just be free. He reminds us that laughter and madness aren't weaknesses. They're part of being alive. That joy can be sacred. That breaking the rules, every once in a while, can be divine. So far, we've traveled through storms, wars, heartbreak, and revelry. But now it's time to look at balance again, at twins who represented two sides of nature itself. Apollo and Artemis, light and shadow, sun and moon, music and wilderness. Two gods bound together, yet utterly different. And their stories remind us that sometimes the deepest harmony comes from contrast. After the noise and frenzy of Dionysus, the wine, the laughter, the wild dancing in the woods, it's almost refreshing to step into a different kind of story. One that's quieter, balanced, and steady, yet still full of drama, because not all gods were storms of chaos, some represented harmony, and no two gods embodied that delicate balance more than the divine twins, Apollo and Artemis. They were born together, grew together, and yet stood for two completely different forces of nature. He was the god of light, music, prophecy, and civilization. She was the goddess of the hunt, wilderness, and the untamed moonlight, sun and moon, civilization and wildness. Brother and sister, opposites that somehow completed each other. Like so many Greek myths, their story began with Hera's jealousy. Zeus had fallen for the Titaness Leto, and when Hera discovered the affair, she unleashed her fury. Hera decreed that no land under the sun could shelter Leto as she prepared to give birth. Imagine being heavily pregnant and hunted across the world, turned away by every island, every city, because the queen of the gods had banned you. At last, Leto found refuge on a floating island, Delos, because it wasn't fixed to the earth, it wasn't bound by Hera's curse. There, Leto gave birth to her twins. First came Artemis, who, according to legend, immediately helped deliver her brother Apollo. From the moment of her birth, Artemis was independent, capable, and fiercely protective. Apollo followed, radiant and golden, destined to bring light into the world. Their births weren't just the start of two lives. They were the dawn of two forces that would shape Greek imagination forever. Let's start with Apollo. If you picture the perfect golden boy of Olympus, that's him. Golden hair, golden lyre, golden chariot. The god practically sparkled. He was associated with the sun, driving his radiant chariot across the sky each day. But Apollo wasn't just about light. He was also about order, beauty, and harmony. He was the god of music and poetry, his lyre filling Olympus with melodies. He was the god of prophecy, with his most famous sanctuary at Delphi, where the oracles spoke his cryptic words to mortals seeking answers. Kings, generals, and ordinary people alike came to hear what Apollo had to say about their futures. He was also an archer, striking down enemies with deadly precision. But unlike Ares, Apollo's violence wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, deliberate. Like a surgeon's cut, he could bring plagues with his arrows, or healing, since he was also tied to medicine through his son, Asclepius. In Apollo, the Greeks saw the ideal of reason and beauty. He represented civilization at its finest, art, intellect, prophecy, and measured strength. And then there was Artemis, his twin. If Apollo was golden sunlight, Artemis was silver moonlight. She was the goddess of the hunt, wild animals, and the wilderness itself. Artemis was fiercely independent. She swore never to marry, never to be bound by romance or domestic life. Instead, she roamed forests and mountains, bow in hand, accompanied by a band of loyal nymphs. She protected women and children, punished those who disrespected nature, and stood as a figure of untamed freedom. Her punishments could be brutal. Take Actaeon, a hunter who stumbled upon Artemis bathing. Rather than forgive him, she turned him into a stag, and his own hounds tore him apart. It was a terrifying reminder. Artemis demanded respect, and she wasn't afraid to enforce it. Yet she also had a protective side. Women prayed to her for safe childbirth. Travelers asked for her blessing under the moonlight. She was both fierce and nurturing, harsh and compassionate, embodying the contradictions of the wild itself. Together, Apollo and Artemis balanced each other. He ruled the day, she ruled the night. He represented civilization, art, and order. She embodied the wilderness, instinct, and freedom. He sang with the lyre, she hunted with the bow. But they weren't enemies, they were complements. Each made the other whole, just as day needs night, and light needs shadow. The Greeks loved this duality because it reflected their own world. They lived between city and countryside, between order and chaos, between logic and instinct. Apollo and Artemis weren't just gods, they were metaphors for the balance of life itself. Apollo's myths are some of the most famous in Greek tradition. The Python of Delphi. Early in his life, Apollo slew the giant serpent Python, claiming the oracle at Delphi as his own. The slaying of the serpent symbolized the triumph of order and clarity, Apollo over chaos and darkness. Daphne and Apollo fell in love with the nymph Daphne, but she wanted nothing to do with him. As he pursued her, she prayed to her father, a river god, for help. He transformed her into a laurel tree, and Apollo, heartbroken, declared the laurel his sacred plant. From then on, laurel wreaths crowned victors in games and poetry contests, a bittersweet reminder of a love that ended in loss. Hyacinthus, another tragic story. Apollo loved a mortal youth named Hyacinthus. During a discus game, the boy was struck and killed. Some say by accident, others by the jealous god Zephyrus. From his blood, Apollo caused a flower to bloom, the hyacinth, keeping his memory alive. These stories show Apollo's duality, radiant and noble, but also vulnerable to passion and grief. Artemis's myths highlight her independence and ferocity. Niobe, a mortal queen who boasted she was better than Leto because she had more children. Apollo and Artemis, enraged at the insult to their mother, killed all of Niobe's sons and daughters. The number varies in different versions. Niobe was turned to stone, weeping eternally. Orion, a great hunter who became a companion of Artemis. Their friendship, or in some versions romance, was cut short when Orion was killed, either by Apollo's jealousy or by Artemis herself in a tragic mistake. She placed him among the stars as a constellation, forever hunting across the night sky. Callisto, one of her followers, who broke her vow of chastity after Zeus disguised himself and seduced her. When the truth came out, Artemis cast Callisto out, and later she was transformed into a bear. Eventually, she too became a constellation, Ursa Major. These myths show Artemis as both protector and punisher, nurturing to those loyal to her, merciless to those who broke her trust or disrespected her. Both Apollo and Artemis were deeply important to the Greeks. Apollo's sanctuary at Delphi was the most famous religious site in the ancient world, second only to Olympia. His prophecies shaped decisions of kings and generals, and his festivals, like the Pythian Games, celebrated music and athletics. Artemis was worshipped in places like Ephesus, where one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis, was dedicated to her. Hunters, women, and entire communities looked to her as a guardian. Together, they weren't just gods of stories, they were part of daily life, woven into prayer, ritual, and culture. Apollo and Artemis endure because they capture a truth the Greeks, and maybe all of us, know well. Life is about balance, day and night, civilization and wilderness, art and instinct, order and chaos. The twins show us that opposites aren't enemies, they're partners. Each needs the other to make the world whole. We've now walked with the radiant Apollo and the fierce Artemis, twin forces of light and shadow. But mythology has one more surprise waiting: a shift from gods to monsters, from divinity to tragedy. Because some of the most unforgettable figures in Greek myth weren't gods at all, and none was more haunting than Medusa, the woman turned monster, whose story asks hard questions about power, justice, and survival. That's where we're headed next. So far, we've met gods who thunder, gods who scheme, gods who sing, and gods who drink too much wine. They're larger than life, radiant with power, wrapped in drama. But sometimes, the most unforgettable figures in Greek mythology aren't gods at all. Sometimes they're monsters. And yet, as with so many myths, when you look closely, the line between monster and victim begins to blur. That's never truer than in the story of Medusa, one of the most famous and most misunderstood figures of all. Most of us know Medusa in her simplest forms, a terrifying creature with snakes for hair and a gaze that could turn anyone who looked at her into stone. She lived at the edge of the world, lurking in a shadowy cave, a horror waiting for a hero. That's the version passed down in countless retellings. Medusa the Gorgon, the monster slain by Perseus, her severed head carried as a trophy. She's a face on shields, statues, and mosaics, a warning and a weapon. But that isn't the whole story, not even close. In earlier Greek accounts, like those of Hesiod, Medusa was simply born a monster, one of 3 Gorgon sisters. No explanation, no tragedy, just a creature of chaos, destined to be slain. But centuries later, in the hands of poets like Ovid, her story changed. And that change gave her depth, tragedy, and a very different kind of power. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Medusa wasn't born a monster. She was a mortal woman, breathtakingly beautiful, serving as a priestess in the temple of Athena. Her devotion was pure, her life quiet, her beauty so striking that it drew whispers even in a sacred space. And that beauty, as often happens in Greek myth, became her curse. One day, Poseidon, the god of the sea, saw Medusa. His desire overwhelmed him, and he pursued her into Athena's temple. There, in that sacred space, he violated her. It was an act of violence, not of love. Medusa, a priestess who had vowed chastity, suddenly found herself not only broken but desecrated. The temple of Athena, her goddess, her protector, became the site of her ruin. When Athena discovered what had happened, her fury was absolute. But here's the cruel twist: she didn't punish Poseidon. Gods rarely faced consequences in these stories. Instead, she punished Medusa. Athena transformed Medusa into the creature we all know. Her flowing hair became writhing serpents. Her face, once beautiful, was cursed with a gaze that turned anyone who looked into her eyes to stone. It wasn't protection, it was punishment. Medusa, already a victim, was now condemned to live in isolation, unable to ever again look at another soul without destroying them. Her beauty, once admired, became a weapon against her will. This version of Medusa's story changes everything. She wasn't simply a monster. She was a woman betrayed twice. Once by Poseidon's violence, and again by Athena's cruelty. Banished from the world of mortals, Medusa lived in solitude. Her cave was filled with statues, not carved by human hands, but created by her unwilling power. Men who came seeking her, drawn by tales of glory or the hope of killing a monster, froze in their final moments of fear. Animals, too, sometimes caught her gaze and were turned to stone mid-step. Imagine the loneliness of that existence. No touch, no gaze, no companionship, only serpents whispering around your face and silence broken by the echo of your own footsteps. Over time, her story spread, twisted, retold. She wasn't remembered as a wronged woman. She was remembered as a monster, a beast lurking at the edge of the world. The victim became the villain. This is where Perseus comes in, the hero sent on a quest to slay Medusa. Armed with gifts from the gods, Hermes' winged sandals, Hades' helm of invisibility, Athena's reflective shield, he found her sleeping in her cave. He never looked at her directly. Instead, he watched her reflection in the polished shield. And when the moment came, he struck. Medusa's head was severed in an instant. From her blood, winged Pegasus, the divine horse, sprang forth, along with Chryso, a warrior. Even in death, she gave birth to wonders. Perseus carried her head as a weapon, its gaze still potent even in death. He used it to petrify enemies, and eventually, he gave it to Athena, who affixed it to her shield, the Aegis. The very goddess who had cursed Medusa now wielded her face as a symbol of power. Here's where the story takes on a deeper weight. Because when you step back, Medusa's tale isn't just about a monster slain. It's about injustice. About a woman punished for being victimized. About her pain and her curse being turned into tools for others. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, didn't protect her priestess. She weaponized her. Perseus, the hero, didn't free her. He ended her. And the gods took her head, her trauma, her curse, and made it their trophy. No wonder Medusa resonates so powerfully today. Her face isn't just fearsome, it's tragic. In ancient Greece, Medusa's head, the Gorgonian, became a protective symbol. It was carved onto shields, armor, doorways, and temples meant to ward off evil. The irony is hard to miss. The very face cursed as a punishment became a talisman of protection. Even in her absence, Medusa's image endured. She became both horror and safeguard, both monster and guardian. Over time, especially in modern culture, Medusa has been reimagined not just as a monster but as a symbol of resistance. Her gaze, once a curse, can be seen as a defense, a way to turn back those who would harm her. Feminist readings of her myth see her as a victim of assault, punished unfairly, yet given a power that makes her untouchable. Her serpents are no longer shameful, they're a crown. Her gaze is no longer a curse, it's protection. She's become a symbol of survival, rage, and empowerment, proof that myths don't stay still. They evolve with us, speaking new truths across centuries. So why does Medusa's story still haunt us? Maybe because it asks uncomfortable questions. Who decides who is a monster? Who gets punished and who goes free? What happens when power protects the powerful and the powerless are left to bear the blame? Medusa's tale isn't just a myth from thousands of years ago. It's a mirror. It reflects the way societies, ancient and modern, sometimes treat victims. And it dares us to ask, what do we see when we look into her eyes? As Perseus walked away with Medusa's head, her story could have ended. But in truth, it never did. Her face endured. On shields, in temples, in art, in whispers. She became larger than life, bigger than the myth itself. And as we near the end of our journey through the pantheon, Medusa's story reminds us of something essential. The gods weren't perfect, the myths weren't simple, and the figures we call monsters often carry the deepest truths. Next, we'll step back and look at the pantheon as a whole, not as flawless beings, but as a divine family full of contradictions. Flawed, emotional, and strikingly human. And maybe that's why their stories still matter. We've walked through storms and shadows, through battles, betrayals, romances, and heartbreaks. We've met the thunder-throwing Zeus, the vengeful Hera, the wise Athena, the bloodthirsty Ares, the radiant Apollo, the wild Dionysus, and even Medusa, whose story lingers like a question mark. And now, as we close this journey, it's time to step back, to look not at one god or one story, but at the whole pantheon, the family of Greek gods as a group. Because here's the thing, they weren't perfect. They weren't all wise, all benevolent, flawless beings floating above humanity. They were emotional, unpredictable, flawed. And that's exactly why their stories have lasted so long. Think about it, Zeus was the king of the gods, the enforcer of justice, the wielder of thunder, and also a reckless lover whose side projects created endless chaos. Hera was the goddess of marriage, yet lived in a marriage that was a storm of betrayal. Athena was wise and strategic, but also capable of terrifying pride. As embodied the brutality of war, hated even by his own father. These weren't distant, perfect beings. They were mirrors of us, magnified, yes, but still familiar. They laughed, they wept, they raged, they schemed. The Greeks didn't imagine gods who were better than humans. They imagined gods who were human, only louder, brighter, more extreme. That's what made them compelling. That's why people prayed to them, feared them, loved them, and told stories about them. Every god's flaw carried a lesson. Zeus showed that power without restraint leads to endless trouble. Hera showed how dignity can survive even when love is betrayed. Athena showed the strength of wisdom and the danger of hubris. Ares showed the horror of violence without reason. Aphrodite showed both the beauty and chaos of desire. Poseidon showed the unpredictability of nature, generous one moment, vengeful the next. Hades showed that even in the shadows of death, there could be order and authority without cruelty. And Medusa, though not counted among the Olympians, showed that sometimes the ones labelled monsters carry the deepest truths about injustice and survival. These flaws didn't make the stories weaker, they made them stronger, they made them human. What makes the Greek pantheon so fascinating is its contradictions. The gods were supposed to be immortal, mighty, above mortals, and yet they quarreled like siblings, loved recklessly, punished unfairly, and sometimes made mistakes so enormous they rippled across the world. Why would a culture imagine its gods this way? Maybe because the Greeks understood that perfection is boring. Flaws are what makes stories worth telling. A perfect god sitting on a throne, never making mistakes, never losing their temper, never loving unwisely. That's not a god you can tell 100 stories about. That's not a god you can laugh at, fear, or see yourself in. But a god who cheats, who rages, who feels jealousy, who mourns a child, who makes bad decisions. That's a god you can recognize. That's a god whose stories you'll pass down for generations. Imagine living in ancient Greece. The world is unpredictable. Storms wreck ships, plagues sweep through cities, wars break out without warning. Life feels fragile. Now imagine knowing your gods are flawed too. They fight, they weep, they get jealous, they fall in love with the wrong people. Somehow, that makes the chaos of the world feel less cruel. If even the gods can't keep it together, maybe it's okay that humans struggle too. The myths didn't just explain natural forces. They gave comfort. They said you're not alone in your flaws. Even the gods are like this. It's been thousands of years since the Greeks first told these tales, and yet we still tell them. Why? Because they aren't just about gods. They're about us. We still wrestle with power and responsibility, like Zeus. We still struggle with loyalty and betrayal, like Hera. We still debate strategy versus brute force, like Athena and Ares. We still fall in love unwisely, like Aphrodite's stories remind us. We still mourn, like Demeter mourned Persephone. We still look at people labeled monsters and ask if maybe the label hides a deeper truth, as Medusa's tale teaches us. The gods of Olympus endure, because they were never really about Olympus. They were about the human heart. When you step back, the pantheon looks like a family. A dysfunctional family, sure, but a family nonetheless. Siblings who fight, parents who betray, children who rebel, outsiders who demand a place at the table. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's familiar. And maybe that's why the Greeks never tried to clean it up. They didn't make their gods perfect role models. They made them story-worthy. So as we close the book on these 12 parts, what do we see? Not a set of flawless deities, but a pantheon of flawed, emotional, contradictory beings who reflected the world around them. They were storms and sunlight, cruelty and kindness, wisdom and folly. They were divine and human at the same time. And in their flaws, they gave the Greeks, and us, a way to understand life. Because at the end of the day, maybe perfection isn't what makes something divine. Maybe it's the flaws, the contradictions, the humanity shining through that make a story last forever. And that's why, even now, when the temples are ruins and the prayers have long since faded, the stories of the Greek gods still echo, not as tales of perfection, but as reminders that even the mightiest beings carry the same chaos, heartbreak, and beauty that live in us all.